The day they buried Rose Chen was the coldest day of the year. Grey clouds hung low in the sky, and a biting wind swept through the cemetery. Her son Thomas stood by the grave long after everyone else had left, unable to believe his mother was truly gone. Rose had always been so full of life. At 62, she still went on morning walks, tended to her garden, and hosted Sunday dinners for the whole family. That's why her sudden death made no sense to Thomas. The doctor said it was a heart attack, but his mother had just had a checkup 2 months ago. Perfect health for a woman her age, the doctor had told her then. Something's not right, Thomas whispered to himself as he finally turned to leave the cemetery. In the weeks that followed, Thomas found himself alone in his mother's house, sorting through her belongings. The home still smelled like her, a mix of jasmine tea and the lavender sachets she kept in her drawers. Every item he packed away felt like saying goodbye all over again. Then, on a rainy afternoon, he found it. Hidden beneath stacks of old photos in her bedside table was a small leather-bound journal. Thomas hadn't known his mother kept one. He sat on the edge of her bed, the same bed where they'd found her, and began to read. The first entries were ordinary, notes about her garden, recipes she wanted to try, thoughts about books she was reading. But as Thomas flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The handwriting became hurried, almost frantic in places. "I found my tea tasted strange again today," one entry read. "When I mentioned it to Alan, he said I was imagining things. But I'm not. Something's wrong. I've been feeling dizzy in the afternoons." Thomas felt his heart pound in his chest. Alan Chen, his mother's husband of only 8 months. A man who had appeared in Rose's life out of nowhere, had a community center art class. He read on, his hands shaking. "Alan insists on cooking all our meals now, says he wants to take care of me. But twice now I've caught him watching me eat, like he's waiting for something. Yesterday I pretended to finish my soup, but poured most of it in a plant when he left the room. I felt fine all evening, no dizziness." Thomas had never liked Alan. The way he charmed his mother, showering her with expensive gifts and whisking her away on surprise trips. 3 months after they met, they were married in a small ceremony. Thomas had tried to suggest waiting, getting to know each other better, but his mother had just smiled and said, "At my age, dear, you don't waste time when you find love." The journal entries grew more disturbing. "I started keeping my own food hidden in my craft room. When Alan asks why I'm not hungry, I tell him I had a big lunch with my friends. I don't have the energy I used to. Something is very wrong." The final entry was dated just 3 days before she died. "Found Alan in my craft room today. He said he was looking for scissors, but I keep those in the kitchen and he knows it. I think he found my food stash. I don't feel safe anymore. I'm going to talk to Thomas tomorrow. I need to get out of here." But she never called. The next Thomas heard, his neighbor had found Rose unresponsive in her bed. By the time he arrived, Alan was there with the paramedics, crying and holding her hand. Thomas closed the journal, his mind racing. All these months, he tried to ignore his gut feeling about Alan. The way the man had appeared in their lives so suddenly. How quickly he'd moved into his mother's beautiful home, the home Thomas's father had built before he passed away 5 years ago. Outside, rain pelted against the windows. In another part of the house, he could hear Alan moving around, supposedly packing up his things. Thomas slipped the journal into his jacket pocket. A terrible suspicion was taking root in his mind, one that would not let him rest until he uncovered the truth. The next morning, Thomas walked into the Oakwood police station with his mother's journal clutched tightly in his hand. The front desk officer, an older woman with kind eyes, directed him to Detective Wilson's desk. "What can I do for you today?" Detective Wilson asked. He was a heavy-set man with salt and pepper hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of too many long nights. Thomas placed the journal on the detective's desk and told him everything about his mother's sudden death, her perfect health, the strange entries in her journal, and his suspicions about Alan. Detective Wilson listened, making notes occasionally. When Thomas finished, the detective leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "I understand you're grieving, Mr. Chen," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But what you're suggesting is a serious accusation." "I know how it sounds," Thomas said, But please just read the journal. The detective flipped through the pages, his expression unchanging. Look, he said finally, your mother's death certificate was signed by Dr. Patel. He found no evidence of foul play, just a heart attack, which can happen suddenly even to healthy people. But the journal shows that your mother was confused, possibly paranoid. That happens sometimes with older folks. The detective slid the journal back across the desk. And your stepfather has an alibi for the day she died. He was at the spring charity luncheon with at least 50 witnesses from 11 a.m. until they found your mother at 4 p.m. Thomas felt a flare of anger. She was 62, not 92, and she was sharp as a tack. Detective Wilson's face softened. Grief can make us look for someone to blame, Mr. Chen. I've seen it many times. Take some time, process your loss. If you find actual evidence, bring it to me. Thomas left the station feeling defeated and angry. On the drive home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was letting his mother down. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that Alan had somehow harmed her. That evening, Thomas called his old college roommate, Pete, who now worked as a lawyer. I need help finding someone, Thomas explained after telling him the whole story. Someone who can dig into Alan's background, find out who he really is. 3 days later, Thomas met Jack Simmons in a quiet coffee shop downtown. Jack was a private investigator with 30 years of experience and eyes that seemed to notice everything. Your friend Pete speaks highly of you, Jack said, stirring sugar into his coffee. Tell me what you need. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas barely slept. He went to work, came home, and waited for updates from Jack. Alan had moved out of Rose's house by then, taking only what he called sentimental items and leaving Thomas to handle the rest. It made Thomas sick to think about Alan walking away with pieces of his mother's life. Then, on a Tuesday evening, Jack called. We need to meet. Not over the phone. An hour later, Thomas sat across from Jack at the same coffee shop, watching as the investigator pulled out a folder. Your stepfather's real name isn't Alan Chen, Jack said, his voice low. I've tracked at least 3 different names he's used in the past 15 years. Thomas felt his heart rate quicken. What? David Wilson in Seattle. Robert Tanner in Chicago. Now Alan Chen here. Jack slid photos across the table. Each showed Alan with different women, all older, all well-dressed and seemingly wealthy. These women, Jack continued, were all widows with substantial assets. All 3 married him after whirlwind romances, and all 3 died within 14 months of their weddings. He paused. All from apparent natural causes, 2 heart attacks and 1 stroke. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. And after they died, he inherited everything each time, sold the properties, emptied the accounts, and disappeared. Jack leaned forward. Your mother was number 4, Thomas. And based on the pattern, he's done this before these 3 too. I just haven't traced back far enough yet. Thomas stared at the photos, at the smiling faces of women who had no idea what awaited them. Women like his mother, who had only wanted companionship in their later years. His hands trembled with a mixture of vindication and horror. What do we do now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We take this to Detective Wilson, Jack said. This isn't paranoia anymore. This is a pattern. This time, when Thomas and Jack walked into the police station, Detective Wilson didn't look bored or dismissive. He studied the photos and documents spread across his desk, his brow furrowed. I'll admit this is concerning, he said finally, but it's still mostly circumstantial. We'd need a lot more to reopen the case. Thomas leaned forward. Then how do we get more evidence? The detective rubbed his chin. Unless we can prove your mother didn't die of natural causes, there's not much we can do. Jack spoke up. What about an exhumation order? The word hung in the air. Thomas felt his stomach twist. The thought of disturbing his mother's rest made him feel sick, but the thought of her killer walking free was worse. On what grounds? Detective Wilson asked. New evidence suggesting foul play, Jack said. These patterns, plus we have a toxicology expert who's reviewed the initial reports and says certain poisons wouldn't have been detected in a standard autopsy. 2 weeks and countless sleepless nights later, Thomas found himself standing before Judge Nancy Huang. The courtroom was nearly empty except for the court reporter, the judge, Thomas and his lawyer, and, surprisingly, Alan, who had shown up with an expensive-looking attorney. "Your Honor," Thomas's lawyer argued, "the pattern of suspicious deaths following marriages to the same individual constitutes new evidence that warrants examination." Alan's lawyer scoffed. "This is a grieving son who can't accept his mother's natural death. There's no evidence of wrongdoing, and disturbing Mrs. Chen's final rest based on wild accusations is unconscionable." Thomas couldn't look at Alan, couldn't bear to see the fake concern on his face. Instead, he focused on the small framed photo of his mother he'd brought to court, tucked inside his jacket pocket. Judge Huang was silent for a long time after both sides presented their arguments. Finally, she spoke. "Exhumation is an extraordinary measure, not granted lightly," she began, and Thomas felt his hope sinking. "However," she continued, "the pattern presented by the private investigator is indeed troubling. I am granting the petition for exhumation and additional testing." Alan's face darkened with anger. He whispered something to his lawyer, who immediately stood up. "Your Honor, we intend to appeal this decision immediately." "That is your right," Judge Huang replied calmly. "However, the order stands." The following Monday, under a sky-threatening rain, Thomas stood beside the cemetery caretaker and a small team from the medical examiner's office. A police officer was present to oversee the proceedings. Thomas had insisted on being there. He couldn't bear the thought of his mother going through this alone, even though he knew it wasn't really her anymore. The workers moved with quiet respect, removing the dirt carefully. When they reached the coffin, they secured straps around it and slowly raised it from the ground. It looked smaller than Thomas remembered from the funeral, though just as elegant, polished cherry wood with brass handles, just as his mother had specified in her will. They loaded the coffin onto a transport vehicle and drove to the county medical examiner's facility. Thomas followed in his own car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. At the facility, Dr. Patel, the same doctor who had signed his mother's death certificate, was waiting. He nodded grimly at Thomas. "I hope we don't find anything," he said quietly. "But if there was foul play, we'll find it." They moved the coffin into an examination room. Thomas stood at the far end, his heart hammering in his chest. This was the moment of truth. Either he was right about Alan, or he had dragged everyone through this horrible process for nothing. Dr. Patel nodded to his assistants, who carefully unsealed the coffin. Thomas held his breath as they lifted the lid. The room fell completely silent. Thomas stared, unable to process what he was seeing. The woman in the coffin had gray hair and was approximately his mother's height and build, but it wasn't Rose Chen. It wasn't his mother. With trembling fingers, Thomas pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "I need the police," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm at the medical examiner's office. We've just opened my mother's coffin, and she's not in it." Within an hour, the medical examiner's office was crawling with police. Detective Wilson arrived, looking like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw the open coffin, he stopped short. "Good Lord," he whispered. He turned to Thomas. "I owe you an apology." Thomas barely heard him. He kept staring at the stranger in his mother's coffin, trying to make sense of it all. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice hollow. "We don't know yet," Detective Wilson said. "We'll run her fingerprints, check dental records." By nightfall, the news had spread through town. Thomas sat in a small conference room at the police station, a cold cup of coffee in front of him. Jack Simmons sat beside him, while across the table, Detective Wilson and his partner flipped through files. "We've got officers at Alan Chen's apartment," Detective Wilson said, "but neighbors say they haven't seen him in days." "He knew this was coming," Jack muttered. "We've put out an alert," Wilson's partner added. "Every airport, bus station, and train terminal has his photo." A young officer knocked and entered. "Sir, we've got something from the funeral home." The funeral director, Mr. Lopez, looked like he hadn't slept either. His normally neat appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened. "I've been going through our records over and over," he said. "I handled Mrs. Chen's preparation personally. I know it was her." He ran a hand through his hair. "The only explanation is that someone switched the bodies after our final viewing but before the burial." "How is that possible?" Thomas demanded. "Wasn't the coffin sealed?" Mr. Lopez looked miserable. It was, but he hesitated. The night before the funeral, we had a break-in. Nothing seemed to be taken, so we thought it was just kids. But now? You didn't report it? Detective Wilson asked sharply. We did. Officer Diaz took the report. Nothing was missing, just a window broken. Thomas felt bile rising in his throat. So while we were all grieving, someone broke in and switched my mother with a stranger. No one had an answer. The next morning brought more questions than answers. The forensic team had gone through Alan's apartment with a fine-tooth comb. They'd found a hidden compartment behind a false wall in a closet. Inside were multiple passports with Alan's photo but different names. David Wilson, Robert Tanner, Alan Chen, and 3 others, Detective Wilson explained, showing Thomas the photos. This guy's been playing this game for years. What about my mother? Thomas asked. It was the only question that mattered to him. We're searching all properties connected to any of his identities, Wilson assured him, and we found something interesting in his financial records. Large payments to a private medical facility outside the city. We're getting a warrant now. Later that day, the woman in the coffin was identified as Catherine Bell, a homeless woman who had died of pneumonia 6 months earlier. Her body had been unclaimed at the county morgue until someone, presumably Alan, had arranged for a cremation. Except Catherine Bell's body hadn't been cremated. It had ended up in Rose Chen's coffin. But why? Thomas asked, pacing the small room. Why go through all this trouble? Jack spoke up. Because if everyone believes Rose is dead and buried, no one looks for her. A chill ran down Thomas's spine. Are you saying my mother might be alive? Detective Wilson held up a hand. Don't get ahead of yourself. We don't know anything for certain yet. But a spark of hope had already ignited in Thomas's chest. If his mother wasn't in that coffin, then where was she? And if Alan had gone to such elaborate lengths to fake her death, was it possible he needed her alive for some reason? The detective's phone rang. He'd answered, listened, then looked at Thomas with widened eyes. We've got a lead, he said. The medical facility outside town. They just confirmed that they have a patient who was admitted 6 months ago. A woman in her 60s, brought in by her husband for private long-term care following a stroke. Thomas stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. Is it her? Is it my mother? We don't know yet, Wilson said, already grabbing his jacket, but we're about to find out. Thomas's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he rode in the back of Detective Wilson's police car. They sped through the countryside, emergency lights flashing but sirens off. Thomas stared out the window at the passing trees, trying to calm his racing heart. Could his mother really be alive after all this time? He didn't dare let himself hope too much. Sunny Grove Private Care Facility, Detective Wilson explained as they drove. Very exclusive. Charges a fortune. Most of their patients are wealthy elderly folks whose families want top-notch care. Or people who need to disappear, Jack added from the seat beside Thomas. The facility came into view around a bend, a large white building surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. It looked more like a fancy hotel than a hospital. A team of police officers was already there, speaking with a nervous-looking man in a suit at the entrance. That's Dr. Howard, Wilson said. He runs the place. Thomas barely waited for the car to stop before jumping out. Detective Wilson had to jog to catch up with him. Mr. Chen, please. Let us handle this, the detective said, but Thomas hardly heard him. He was already heading toward the entrance. Inside, the facility was all polished wood and soft lighting. It smelled of fresh flowers and cleaning supplies, nothing like the sterile hospital smell Thomas had expected. Dr. Howard was explaining something to the officers, completely unaware of any irregularities. Mr. Chen, Alan Chen, that is, brought the patient in himself. All the paperwork was in order. She had suffered a severe stroke, or so we were told. I want to see her, Thomas interrupted. All eyes turned to him. Dr. Howard looked uncomfortable. Sir, I understand you believe this might be your mother, but our patients require calm. Now, Thomas said, his voice surprisingly steady. I need to see her now. Detective Wilson placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Dr. Howard, we have reason to believe a crime has been committed. Please take us to the patient immediately. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. Follow me. They walked down a long corridor, their footsteps muffled by thick carpeting. Dr. Howard stopped outside room 217 and lowered his voice. "She's been here for 6 months. Mr. Chen visits every 2 weeks, always brings flowers. He told us her name is Linda Chen, that they've been married for 5 years, and that she had a stroke that affected her speech and mobility." He paused. "She's been sedated most of the time on Mr. Chen's orders. He said it was to manage her pain." Thomas felt sick. "Let me see her, please." Dr. Howard opened the door. The room inside was spacious and bright, with large windows overlooking a garden. A woman lay in the bed, her gray hair spread across the pillow. She was thin, thinner than Thomas remembered, and pale, with tubes running from her arms to various machines. But it was her. "Mom," Thomas whispered, stumbling forward. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. For a moment, she seemed confused. Then her eyes widened with recognition. "T. Thomas?" Her voice was raspy from disuse. Thomas fell to his knees beside the bed, taking her hand in his. "I'm Hina, Mom. I found you." Tears spilled down Rose's cheeks. He did something to me. Put something in my tea. When I woke up, he told everyone I was dead." Detective Wilson stepped forward. "Mrs. Chen, I know this is difficult, but could you tell us what happened?" Over the next hour, as doctors checked Rose's condition, she shared her story in halting sentences. How Alan had drugged her tea that night. How she'd woken up confused in this strange facility. How Alan visited regularly, checking on her condition and consulting with the doctors. "He needed me alive," she explained, her voice growing stronger as the sedatives wore off. "Something about my accounts, needed my signature, my fingerprints." Detective Wilson nodded grimly. "We found evidence that someone's been accessing your accounts, moving money around. Big transfers to offshore banks. We thought it was just identity theft after your death, but this?" "He couldn't just kill me," Rose said. "Not right away. He needed access to the trust fund from your father. It's set up so that only I can make changes." Thomas squeezed his mother's hand. "The money's not important. You're alive. That's all that matters." Meanwhile, forensic accountants were combing through Alan's financial records. What they found was staggering. Not just Rose's accounts, but millions from his previous victims, all flowing through a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. He wasn't working alone, Detective Wilson explained later, showing Thomas and Jack a diagram of money flows. "There's no way one person could set all this up. We're looking at a sophisticated operation with multiple players." As evening fell, Thomas sat by his mother's bedside while she slept naturally for the first time in months. The doctors had assured him that with proper care and physical therapy, she would likely make a full recovery. Outside the room, Wilson was on the phone. When he finished, he came in with a grim expression. "We got a hit on one of Alan's passports," he said quietly, not wanting to wake Rose. "He's trying to leave the country. Flight to Hong Kong." "Did you get him?" Thomas asked. Wilson shook his head. "Not yet. But we've alerted airport security. Every exit is being watched." Rose stirred in her sleep, and Thomas gently squeezed her hand. He had found his mother against all odds. Now they just needed to catch the man who had tried to take her away from him. The airport buzzed with activity as police officers in plainclothes positioned themselves near every gate and exit. Thomas sat in the airport security office, watching the monitors that showed different areas of the terminal. Detective Wilson stood behind him, talking quietly into his radio. "Target spotted at gate 37, came a voice over the radio, moving to intercept." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes searching the screens until he found the right camera. There, walking calmly toward the international departures gate, was Alan. He looked different. He'd dyed his hair blonde and grown a beard, but Thomas would recognize that walk anywhere. The confident stride of a man who thought he was always the smartest person in the room. "Got you," Thomas whispered. On screen, 2 officers approached Alan from either side. For a moment, it looked like he would surrender peacefully. Then suddenly, he shoved an elderly woman into one of the officers and took off running. "He's heading for the emergency exit," Wilson shouted into his radio. Thomas watched, heart pounding, as Alan sprinted through the terminal, knocking people aside. He pushed through an emergency door and ran straight into 4 waiting officers. Within seconds, he was on the ground, handcuffed. Thomas felt a rush of emotions, relief, satisfaction, and a strange emptiness. It was over, but somehow catching Alan didn't feel as important as it once had. His mother was alive. That was what mattered most. 3 days later, Thomas sat in a small room at the police station. Through the one-way glass, he could see Alan in an interview room, talking with his lawyer. The man looked smaller somehow, less threatening in his orange jumpsuit. The door opened and Detective Wilson entered with a woman in a suit. "This is District Attorney Patel," Wilson said. "She wants to talk to you about a development in the case." The DA got straight to the point. "Mr. Chen, your stepfather is offering us information in exchange for consideration in his sentencing." Thomas frowned. "What kind of information?" "He claims he wasn't working alone," she said. "He says he's part of a larger organization that targets wealthy individuals across the country." "And you believe him?" Thomas asked. "We've verified some of what he's told us already," Wilson said. "Names, dates, bank accounts. It checks out." DA Patel leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, we want to bring down this entire operation, not just one man. But we need your approval before offering any kind of deal." Thomas thought about his mother, still recovering in the hospital, about the other victims who hadn't been as lucky. What kind of deal are we talking about? No death penalty. Life sentence with the possibility of parole after 25 years in exchange for his full cooperation. Thomas felt a surge of anger. "He tried to kill my mother. He did kill others. And he'll spend at least 25 years in prison," the DA assured him. "But if what he's saying is true, there are other people out there doing the same thing. People who might be targeting someone's mother or father right now." Thomas was quiet for a long time. Finally, he nodded. "Do what you need to do." The next day, Thomas sat across from Alan in an interview room. 2 detectives and the DA were present, recording everything. Thomas had insisted on being there, on looking into the eyes of the man who had nearly taken his mother from him. Alan looked nervous. His confident mask finally cracked. "I want to make one thing clear," he said, his voice hoarse. "I never killed anyone directly. I was the front man, the charmer." "Tell us how it works," Detective Wilson said. "All of it." For the next 2 hours, Alan described an operation that made Thomas's blood run cold. A network of people, doctors who falsified death certificates, funeral home employees who were paid to switch bodies, financial experts who moved money through untraceable channels, and charmers like Alan who seduced the targets. "We call them living ghosts," Alan explained. "People legally dead but physically alive, kept just healthy enough to sign documents and provide fingerprints when needed. Once the accounts are drained, they're—" He paused, not meeting Thomas's eyes. "They're disposed of." "How many people are involved in this?" the DA asked. "At least 30 that I know of across 5 states. But I think it's bigger than that. I only know my cell." "And who runs it?" Detective Wilson asked. Alan shook his head. "I don't know. We have handlers, that's all. Mine was a woman named Vivian. That's probably not her real name." As the interview continued, Thomas felt sick listening to how coldly Alan described targeting his mother. How he'd researched her habits, her friends, her finances for months before accidentally meeting her at the art class. "Why my mother?" Thomas finally asked when there was a pause. "Why her specifically?" Alan looked at him for the first time. She was perfect. Wealthy, recently widowed, no family except one son who lived across town. And she was lonely. He looked down at his hands. Lonely people are easy targets. They want to believe someone cares. Thomas stood up, unable to listen anymore. As he reached the door, Alan called after him. "For what it's worth, your mother was different. I actually liked her. That's why I kept her alive longer than the others." Thomas turned back, his voice steady despite the rage and disgust he felt. "That's worth nothing, nothing at all." He walked out without looking back. What mattered now was helping his mother heal, not wasting another minute on the man who had tried to destroy their lives. Rose Chen sat in her garden, watching the butterflies dance around her newly planted flowers. It had been 4 months since her rescue, and each day brought small victories. Today, she had walked all the way from the house to the garden bench without her cane, a distance that would have seemed impossible weeks ago. "Tea's ready, Mom," Thomas called from the back door of the house, her house, which she had reclaimed along with her life. Thomas carried a tray with 2 steaming cups and some cookies that Rose recognized as her own recipe. He had been baking her favorites lately, determined to help her regain the weight she'd lost during her captivity. "The roses are doing well," she said as he sat beside her. "They just needed some care." Like me, she thought but didn't say. Thomas would only worry more, and he'd done enough worrying to last a lifetime. "Detective Wilson called this morning," Thomas said, handing her a cup. "They caught another one of them, a doctor who'd falsified death certificates for the organization." Rose nodded. The investigation had expanded rapidly after Alan's confession. Police across 5 states were working together, following the money trail and tracking down suspects. So far, 18 people had been arrested, and more were being identified every week. "He also said they found 2 more people like you," Thomas continued carefully. "A man in Chicago and a woman in Florida. Both alive, being kept in similar facilities." Rose closed her eyes briefly, thinking of those poor souls. How long? The man for almost a year. The woman just 3 months. Thomas squeezed her hand. "They're going to be okay, Mom. Just like you." Rose wasn't so sure about okay. She still had nightmares about waking up in that facility, about Alan's face hovering over her bed as he explained that to the world she was already dead. No one was looking for her. No one would find her. But Thomas had found her. Her son, who had always been too stubborn for his own good. "The support group starts next week," Rose said. "I think I'll go." Thomas smiled. A therapist who specialized in trauma had suggested that Rose might benefit from connecting with other victims of serious crimes. Rose had resisted the idea at first. What could anyone else possibly understand about what she'd been through? But lately, she'd been reconsidering. "I'll drive you," Thomas offered. "Or do you want to try driving yourself?" Rose had been hesitant to drive since her return home. Not because of any physical limitations. Her doctors were amazed at how well she was recovering, but because of the lingering fear that her independence had been taken from her forever. "I think I'll drive," she said, surprising them both. That evening, they watched the news together. A special report came on about the living ghosts case, as the media had dubbed it. The reporter stood outside a courthouse where Alan's handler, Vivian, had been arraigned that morning on multiple charges. "Turn it up," Rose said. She wanted to see this woman's face, to know who had helped orchestrate her nightmare. Vivian looked ordinary, a middle-aged woman with light brown hair who could have been anyone's neighbor or co-worker. It was hard to reconcile her unremarkable appearance with the horror she had helped create. "The investigation has revealed that this criminal enterprise has been operating for at least 12 years, the reporter was saying. Authorities now believe that over 30 victims may have been targeted, with as many as 20 having lost their lives after their assets were fully drained. Thomas reached for the remote, but Rose put her hand on his arm. "Leave it. I need to hear this." The story continued, explaining how brave family members like Thomas Chen had refused to accept the official story and had pushed for investigations that eventually exposed the truth. "They're calling you a hero," Rose said softly when the segment ended. Thomas shook his head. "I just couldn't let you go." That night, Rose stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the stars. The same stars she had thought she would never see again during those long months of captivity. Her body still ached sometimes, and her mind still played tricks on her, making her fear that this was the dream and the facility was the reality. But those moments were growing fewer. In the morning, she would plant more flowers. She would continue her physical therapy exercises. She would call her old friends from the art class, the ones who had attended her funeral and mourned her, and arrange to meet them for lunch. Life would go on, different but still hers. 3 weeks later, Rose and Thomas attended the sentencing hearing for Alan Chen. He didn't look at them as the judge announced his sentence, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The deal he had made only protected him from the death penalty. It didn't guarantee a light sentence. As they left the courthouse, reporters called out questions. Rose had avoided the media until now, but today she felt strong enough to speak. "Mrs. Chen, how does it feel to see the man who tried to kill you sentenced?" Rose took a deep breath. "Justice is important, but it's not what gets me out of bed in the morning. What matters is that I'm alive." I have a second chance that many others didn't get." Later, as Thomas drove them home, Rose watched the familiar streets pass by. In a few months, she would testify at more trials. The full story of the organization was still unfolding, with investigators now looking into similar cases going back 15 years. But today, she was just a woman going home to tend her garden. A woman who had stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. A woman whose son had refused to give up on her, even when all hope seemed lost. "Thank you for digging up my grave," she said suddenly. Thomas glanced at her, surprised, then smiled. "Well, it's not every day a son gets to save his mother by digging up her empty grave." Rose laughed, and it felt good. Real, like she was finally, truly coming back to life.